Let me ask you something. When was the last time you heard about a battle where farmers, actual peasants with farming tools, annihilated an army of professional knights? Not just defeated, annihilated. Because that's not how medieval warfare is supposed to work, right? Knights are the apex predators of the battlefield. Trained from childhood, armored head to toe, mounted on warhorses, supported by wealth, training, and centuries of military tradition. Peasants are supposed to die. They're supposed to run. They're supposed to get trampled underfoot while the nobles decide the fate of kingdoms. Except on November 1315, in a narrow mountain pass above a lake called Aigery, that entire logic got flipped upside down. 1,500 Swiss mountain farmers, men with no armor, no horses, no formal military training, faced 9,000 Austrian knights and professional soldiers led by Duke Leopold I of Habsburg. And when the day was done, the Austrians were butchered. Hundreds drowned in the lake, dragged down by their own armor. Hundreds more were hacked to pieces on the mountainside, and the survivors fled in panic, abandoning their equipment, their wounded, and any illusion that noble cavalry was invincible. This wasn't just a military upset. This was the birth of the Swiss Confederation. This was the moment Switzerland stopped being a collection of rebellious valleys and became a nation. This was the day peasant infantry proved it could destroy the finest cavalry in Europe. And if you understand how Morgarten happened, you understand how Switzerland became what it is today, fiercely independent, militarily formidable, and absolutely uninterested in bowing to anyone. So here's what we're doing. We're going to reconstruct this battle from the ground up. We are going to examine the terrain, the tactics, the weapons, the leadership decisions, and the sheer audacity of 1,500 farmers deciding to fight instead of surrender. And by the end, you'll understand exactly why Morgarten is one of the most consequential battles in European history, and why most people have never heard of it. If that sounds worth your time, hit that like button right now. Because this is the kind of history that doesn't get taught in schools. No oversimplification, no romanticization, just the raw, tactical, strategic truth about how a bunch of Swiss peasants broke the Habsburg Empire and changed Europe forever. Let's start with the Habsburgs. Because if you don't understand who they were in 1315 and what they wanted, you won't understand why Morgarten mattered. The House of Habsburg in the early 14th century wasn't yet the sprawling dynasty that would dominate Europe for centuries, but they were ambitious, they were powerful. And they were expanding. Their core territories were in what's now Austria and southern Germany. They held the title of Holy Roman Emperor intermittently. They controlled key trade routes, and they had money, lots of it. Which meant they could afford professional soldiers, heavy cavalry, siege equipment, and all the infrastructure necessary to wage sustained military campaigns. In 1315, the head of the family was Duke Leopold I of Austria. Leopold was 35 years old. He was the younger brother of Duke Frederick the Fair, who was locked in a power struggle for the Holy Roman Emperor title against Louis IV of Bavaria. That conflict meant the Habsburgs needed to consolidate their power base. They needed to secure their territories. They needed to demonstrate strength. And they needed to crush any threats to their authority. The Swiss valleys were a threat, not a military threat. The Swiss didn't have armies. They didn't have fortifications. They were just scattered communities of farmers, herders, and traders living in the mountainous regions south of the Rhine. But they were refusing to submit to Habsburg authority. They were rejecting taxes. They were ignoring edicts. And worse, they were forming alliances with each other, mutual defense pacts that suggested they thought they could resist Habsburg rule collectively. This was intolerable, not because the Swiss valleys were strategically vital. Not because they were wealthy, but because letting peasants define noble authority set a precedent. If the Swiss got away with it, other regions might try the same thing. The entire feudal order depended on the idea that nobles ruled and peasants obeyed. Allowing peasants to organize, resist, and govern themselves was a direct challenge to that order. So Leopold decided to crush them, to march into the valleys with overwhelming force, burn their villages, kill their leaders, and make it absolutely clear that defiance had consequences. It wasn't just about the Swiss. It was about sending a message to everyone else in the region. This is what happens when you refuse to obey. In October 1315, Leopold assembled his army. The core of his force was heavy cavalry, knights and men-at-arms, fully armored, mounted on warhorses, trained for shock combat. These weren't amateurs. These were professional warriors from noble families who had spent their lives preparing for war. They wore plate and chainmail. They carried lances, swords, maces. They were the medieval equivalent of tanks, slow, heavily armored, and devastating in a charge. Leopold also brought infantry, spearmen, crossbowmen, support troops tasked with protecting the cavalry flanks and dealing with fortifications. And he brought supply wagons, siege equipment, and all the logistical infrastructure necessary for a campaign in mountainous terrain. Total force, somewhere between 8,000 and 9,000 men. The exact number is debated, but all sources agree it was a large, well-equipped professional army, and it was commanded by a duke who had every reason to believe this would be a quick, easy campaign. March into the valleys, burn a few villages, accept some surrenders, go home victorious. Leopold wasn't expecting a battle. He was expecting a submission. Now let's talk about the Swiss. Because in 1315, Switzerland didn't exist. What existed were three small regions, Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden, collectively known as the Forest Cantons. These were rural, mountainous areas populated by farmers, herders, and small-town merchants. They weren't wealthy, they weren't powerful, and they weren't unified in any formal sense, but they had something the Habsburgs didn't, a shared interest in independence. These valleys had traditionally enjoyed a degree of autonomy under previous rulers. They governed themselves locally, managed their own affairs, and paid relatively light taxes. But the Habsburgs wanted to centralize authority, increase taxation, and bring the valleys under direct control. That meant appointing Habsburg officials, enforcing Habsburg laws, and eliminating local self-governance. The Swiss resisted. Not through rebellion or open warfare, but through passive defiance. They ignored Habsburg officials. They refused to pay new taxes. They continued to govern themselves according to traditional customs. And in 1291, the three forest cantons had signed a mutual defense pact, the Federal Charter, pledging to support each other if any of them were attacked. It was a simple document, no grand declarations of independence, no revolutionary ideology. Just a practical agreement. If someone attacks one of us, we all fight. That pact held. And when Leopold's army marched toward the valleys in October 1315, the Swiss understood what was coming. Submission or destruction. There was no negotiation, no compromise. Leopold wasn't interested in terms. He was interested in obedience. So the Swiss prepared to fight. But how do you fight 9,000 professional soldiers when you have no army, no armor, and no cavalry? You don't meet them in open battle. You don't march out onto a plain and line up in neat formations. You use the one advantage you have, terrain. The Swiss knew the mountains. They knew every pass, every trail, every narrow defile where an army would be forced to march in a column. They knew where the ground was unstable, where the slopes were steep, where there was no room to maneuver. And they knew that heavy cavalry, the core of Leopold's military power, was useless in terrain where horses couldn't charge. The plan was simple. Let Leopold march into the mountains. Wait for him to commit to a route. Then hit him where he's most vulnerable, in a narrow pass where his numbers are meaningless and his cavalry can't deploy. The location they chose was Morgarten, a narrow pass on the eastern shore of Lake Egery in the canton of Schwyz. The pass ran along the base of a steep, forested hillside. On one side was the lake, on the other side was the mountain. The road through the pass was maybe 10 meters wide at its narrowest point. It was the perfect choke point. An army marching through Morgarten would be strung out in a column, unable to form battle lines, unable to maneuver. And if something blocked the front of the column or attacked from above, there would be nowhere to go except into the lake. The Swiss positioned themselves on the hillside above the pass. Roughly 1,500 men, farmers mostly, men from Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden who had grabbed whatever weapons they had, halberds, pikes, axes, clubs, hunting bows, and marched to Morgarten to defend their homes. They weren't professional soldiers. They didn't have uniforms or standardized equipment, but they had motivation. They were fighting for survival, for their families, for their way of life, and they had the high ground. On the morning of November 15, 1315, Leopold's army marched into the pass. He had scouts, but they hadn't detected the Swiss ambush. Why would they? The Swiss weren't an army, they were peasants. Leopold assumed any resistance would be minimal, disorganized, easy to crush. He had no reason to expect a coordinated attack from the hillside. His army entered the pass in a long column, knights and cavalry at the front, infantry in the middle, supply wagons at the rear. The column stretched for over a kilometer. Movement was slow, the ground was uneven, the horses were nervous. The knights, weighed down by armor, were uncomfortable in the confined space, but Leopold kept them moving. Morgarten was just one more obstacle on the way to Schwyz. Once through the pass, the army would deploy in open ground and begin the campaign in earnest. They never made it through. The Swiss attacked from above, without warning, without formal signals, just a sudden, coordinated assault from the forested hillside, and the first wave wasn't soldiers, it was the mountain itself, boulders, logs, rocks, tree trunks. The Swiss had spent days preparing the hillside, loosening rocks, cutting trees, positioning heavy objects on the slopes above the pass. And when Leopold's column was halfway through, trapped between the lake and the mountain, they let it all go. Imagine you're a knight in that column. You're riding in heavy armor, your vision is limited by your helmet, you're focused on the path ahead, trying to keep your horse calm in the narrow space. And suddenly you hear a sound, a rumbling, a crash. You look up and see a boulder the size of a cart tumbling down the hillside directly toward you. You try to move, but there's nowhere to go. The knight in front of you is blocking the path. The knight behind you is pressing forward. The lake is 5 meters to your left. The mountain is 5 meters to your right, and the boulder hits. It doesn't hit you. It hits the knight in front of you, crushes his horse. The horse screams, goes down, blocks the path. You try to stop your horse. But the column is still moving. Men behind you don't know what's happening. They're pushing forward. Your horse rears. You're thrown. You hit the ground in full armor. You try to stand. And another log comes crashing down the hillside. That was the first phase, pure chaos. The hillside assault broke the column's cohesion before the fighting even started. Horses panicked. Knights were thrown. The narrow pass, which had been tight but manageable, became a death trap. Men and horses piled up. Some were crushed by falling debris. Others were trampled by their own side. The column ground to a halt, jammed into the pass with no way to advance or retreat. And then the Swiss charged. They came down the hillside in a rush. No formations, no cavalry, just men on foot, screaming, moving fast, weapons raised. And their primary weapon was the halberd. If you don't know what a halberd is, it's a long pole weapon with an axe blade on one side, a spike on top, and a hook on the other side. It's designed to do 3 things: chop through armor, stab through gaps, and pull riders off horses. It's the perfect anti-cavalry weapon, and the Swiss had hundreds of them. The knights, stuck in the pass, couldn't charge, they couldn't form lines, they couldn't use their lances effectively, they were sitting targets, and the Swiss swarmed them. A knight in full armor is nearly invulnerable in open combat against unarmored infantry. The armor deflects slashes. The mobility of the horse allows escape. The reach of the lance keeps enemies at distance. But in a narrow pass, dismounted or unable to maneuver, that armor becomes a liability. It's heavy, it restricts movement, and the Swiss weren't trying to cut through the armor. They were using the halberd hooks to pull knights off their horses, the spikes to stab into gaps, armpits, neck, groin, and the axe blades to smash through helmets and limbs. The fighting was brutal, close quarters. No room for tactics, just raw violence. Knights swinging swords blindly, Swiss farmers hacking with halberds and axes, horses screaming and kicking, men slipping on blood-slicked ground. The noise, metal on metal, screams, the crash of bodies was overwhelming, and the Austrians couldn't retreat. The column was jammed. Men at the front were fighting, men in the middle were trying to push forward to help, men at the rear didn't know what was happening. There was no coordination, no command structure. Leopold was somewhere in the middle of the column, but he couldn't see the whole battlefield. He couldn't issue orders, he couldn't rally his forces, he was just another man trapped in the chaos. The Swiss pushed the Austrians toward the lake. Slowly, methodically, every step the knights took backward brought them closer to the water, and for a man in full armor, water is death. You can't swim, the weight drags you down. If you fall in, you drown. That's exactly what happened. Knights trying to escape the Swiss onslaught backed into Lake Egerie. Some were pushed, some jumped hoping to escape. None survived. The armor pulled them under. They thrashed for a few seconds, screaming, clawing at the water, and then they sank. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. The lake became a graveyard. The massacre lasted for hours. The Swiss didn't stop. They didn't take prisoners. They didn't negotiate. They just killed, methodically, ruthlessly. Every Austrian soldier in that pass was a threat. Every one of them represented Habsburg oppression. And the Swiss made sure that anyone who entered Morgarten understood the cost of invading their valleys. By midday, the Austrian army was destroyed. Casualties are debated, but most estimates put Austrian dead at 1,500 to 2,000. That's nearly 20% of Leopold's force. Killed in a single morning, in a single narrow pass, by farmers, Leopold himself survived. He was in the middle of the column when the ambush began, and he managed to fight his way out, escaping south with a fraction of his cavalry. But his army was gone, his supplies were gone, his reputation was gone. He had marched into the Swiss valleys with 9,000 men, expecting an easy campaign, and he limped out with maybe 6,000, having achieved nothing except demonstrating that the Swiss could not be intimidated. The Swiss losses were minimal. Estimates range from 50 to 200 dead. Compare that to the Austrian casualties. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. The immediate aftermath of Morgarten was chaos. Leopold retreated to Habsburg territory and tried to salvage the situation. He couldn't admit the defeat publicly. It would destroy his credibility. So the official Habsburg position was that the campaign had been postponed, that the Swiss had used treachery and ambush instead of fighting honorably in open battle, that the Habsburgs would return and finish the job properly. They never did, because Morgarten changed everything. The Swiss had proven that they could defend themselves, not through luck, not through desperation, through tactics, terrain, and coordinated action. And the other Swiss valleys, towns like Lucerne, Zurich, Bern, saw what happened and thought, if Schwyz, Uri, and Unterwalden can defeat the Habsburgs, maybe we can too. Within months, more regions joined the Swiss Confederation. The Federal Charter of 1291, which had been a simple defensive pact between three small valleys, became the foundation of a growing alliance. Other towns and regions signed on, pledging mutual defense and self-governance. The Swiss Confederation was born. Not as a nation in the modern sense, but as a loose coalition of independent regions united by a shared commitment to resist outside domination. And the Habsburgs, they tried to reassert control several times over the next century. They sent armies, they imposed sieges, they negotiated, nothing worked. The Swiss kept fighting, and they kept winning. At Sempach in 1386, Swiss infantry annihilated another Austrian army, killing Duke Leopold III of Austria, the grandson of the Leopold who lost at Morgarten. At Neffels in 1388, a small Swiss force defeated a much larger Austrian army using the same tactics: terrain, ambush, and brutal close-quarters combat. By 1400, the Habsburgs had effectively given up on conquering the Swiss. By 1500, the Swiss Confederation was one of the most formidable military powers in Europe. Swiss mercenaries were sought after by every major kingdom. Swiss pike formations dominated battlefields from Italy to France. And Switzerland itself became the one place in Europe where peasants could tell nobles to go to hell and get away with it. All of that started at Morgarten, on a narrow mountain pass, with 1,500 farmers and a lot of rocks. So what are the lessons here? What does Morgarten teach us about warfare, strategy, and power? First, terrain is everything. The Swiss didn't defeat the Habsburgs through superior numbers, equipment, or training. They defeated them by choosing a battlefield where none of those advantages mattered. In a narrow pass with no room to maneuver, heavy cavalry becomes a liability. Armor becomes a burden. Superior numbers mean nothing if you can't deploy them. The Swiss understood their terrain intimately and used it as a weapon. That's not luck, that's strategy. Second, motivation matters. The Austrian soldiers were professionals, but they were fighting for pay and feudal obligation. The Swiss were fighting for survival, for their homes, for their families. That desperation translated into relentless aggression on the battlefield. The Swiss didn't stop when the Austrians started to break. They pushed until the enemy was annihilated. That kind of ferocity doesn't come from training. It comes from existential necessity. Third, military doctrine isn't sacred. The Habsburgs followed the conventional wisdom of medieval warfare. Heavy cavalry dominates the battlefield, infantry supports them, and peasants don't fight. The Swiss ignored all of that. They built tactics around what they had: terrain, numbers, and desperation, and destroyed an army that should have been unbeatable. That willingness to reject established norms and innovate based on circumstances is a hallmark of successful asymmetric warfare. Fourth, leadership matters, but it's not always about one person. Morgarten wasn't won by a single brilliant general. It was won by collective decision-making and coordination across multiple Swiss communities. They agreed on a plan. They executed it. They didn't need a charismatic hero or a legendary commander. They needed cooperation and discipline. That's harder to achieve than individual brilliance, and it's more reliable in the long run. Finally, Morgarten teaches us about the fragility of power. The Habsburgs were one of the most powerful dynasties in Europe. They had wealth, armies, legitimacy, and political alliances. But they lost to farmers, because power that depends on intimidation and overwhelming force collapses when someone calls the bluff. The Swiss called the bluff. They proved that the Habsburgs could be beaten, and once that belief took hold, Habsburg authority in the region was finished. Morgarten wasn't just a battle, it was a paradigm shift. It proved that peasants could organize, that terrain could neutralize technological superiority, that desperate men with farming tools could kill armored knights, and that a loose coalition of independent communities could resist and defeat an empire. And the ripple effects of that victory extended far beyond Switzerland. Morgarten influenced military thinking across Europe. It inspired other communities to resist noble authority. It contributed to the decline of heavy cavalry as the dominant battlefield force and the rise of infantry formations, pike squares, halberdiers, disciplined foot soldiers who could stand against mounted knights. By the 16th century, the military landscape of Europe had fundamentally changed, and Morgarten was one of the key battles that started that transformation. Switzerland itself became a unique entity in European politics. It remained a loose confederation of independent cantons, fiercely protective of local autonomy, deeply suspicious of centralized authority. It developed a culture of militia service, where every able-bodied man was trained in combat and expected to defend his community. And it became famous for neutrality, not because the Swiss were pacifists, but because they were so effective at warfare that nobody wanted to invade them, and they had no interest in conquering anyone else. That tradition persists today. Switzerland is still a confederation, still neutral, still maintains a militia-based military system, and the cultural memory of Morgarten, of ordinary people standing up to an empire and winning, remains a core part of Swiss identity. So here's my final thought. Morgarten matters because it's a reminder that power is never as absolute as it appears. Empires look invincible until they're not. Conventional wisdom holds until someone breaks it. And sometimes, the most important battles aren't fought by professional armies on open fields. They're fought by desperate people in narrow passes, using whatever they have, refusing to surrender. The Habsburgs thought they were crushing a rebellion. They were actually creating a nation. Duke Leopold thought he was marching into an easy campaign. He was actually marching into history. And 1,500 Swiss farmers thought they were defending their valleys. They were actually changing the course of European history for the next 700 years. That's Morgarten. November 15, 1315, 1,500 peasants, 9,000 knights, a narrow pass, and the birth of Switzerland. If you found this valuable, if you learned something, hit that like button, leave a comment, tell me what you think. Could the Habsburgs have won if they'd scouted the pass properly? Was Morgarten really as decisive as historians claim? What other overlooked battles deserve this kind of analysis? And subscribe, because this is what we do here. Real history, deep dives into the battles that shaped the world. No oversimplification, no fluff. Just the detailed, tactical, strategic truth about how history actually happened. Morgarten, the day farmers killed knights. The day Switzerland was born. That's history, real history. Now let's talk about the weapons. Because if you don't understand the halberd and why it was so devastatingly effective at Morgarten, you won't understand how the Swiss were able to slaughter armored knights at close range. The halberd isn't just a farming tool repurposed for war. It's a purpose-built anti-cavalry weapon that the Swiss perfected over decades of fighting in the mountains. And at Morgarten, it proved its worth in the most brutal way possible. A halberd is a pole weapon, usually between 6 and 8 feet long. At the top, it has 3 offensive elements: an axe blade on one side, a spike on top, and a hook on the opposite side of the axe. That design is genius because it gives the wielder 3 different ways to kill, depending on the situation. The spike can thrust like a spear, targeting gaps in armor or unprotected areas. The axe blade can chop through wooden shields, break bones, and with enough force, crack or dent metal armor. And the hook can grab onto armor, shields, or riders, pulling them off balance or dragging them off their horses. For a peasant fighter facing an armored knight, the halberd is perfect. You don't need to be strong enough to pierce plate armor. You just need to hook the knight, pull him off his horse, and once he's on the ground in 60 pounds of metal, he's slow, vulnerable, and easy to finish off. Stab the spike through the gaps in his armor. Chop with the axe where the armor is weakest. A knight on foot in full armor is not a mobile fighter, he's a target. And at Morgarten, the Swiss used halberds in swarms, not individual duels, mass attacks, multiple men targeting a single knight. One man hooks the knight's shoulder or leg, pulling him off balance. Another thrusts the spike into his armpit or neck. A third brings the axe down on his helmet or collarbone. The knight, even if he's skilled, can't defend against 3 or 4 attackers simultaneously. He's overwhelmed. And in the chaos of the pass, with no room to maneuver, no cavalry support, and no ability to retreat, he dies. The Austrians had no effective counter. Their primary weapon, the cavalry lance, was useless in the narrow pass. Lances are designed for charges on open ground, where speed and impact do the killing. In tight quarters, they're unwieldy and ineffective. Swords are better in close combat, but a sword wielder has to get within arm's reach of the halberdier, and the halberd has superior reach. The knight can try to close the distance, but while he's doing that, he's exposed to the spike, the axe, and the hook. It's a losing fight, and the Swiss weren't fighting honorably. There was no chivalric code at Morgarten, no single combat. No respect for the rules of knightly warfare. The Swiss attacked from above, from behind, in groups. They targeted horses as much as riders because a dismounted knight is half as effective. They didn't give quarter. They didn't take prisoners for ransom. They just killed, efficiently, methodically, without mercy. This was shocking to the Austrians. Knights expected a certain kind of warfare, formal, structured, governed by codes of conduct that both sides understood. You didn't attack from ambush. You didn't target horses. You didn't gang up on individual opponents. And you certainly didn't kill knights who surrendered. Those were the rules, but the Swiss didn't care about the rules. They cared about survival. And survival meant killing every Austrian soldier in that pass before they could regroup and destroy the Swiss valleys. The psychological impact of Morgarten on the Austrian nobility was profound. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was a humiliation. Knights, the warrior elite of medieval Europe, had been butchered by peasants with farming tools. That wasn't supposed to be possible. The entire feudal order rested on the idea that the nobility were the warrior class, superior in combat, justified in their rule by their martial prowess. Morgarten shattered that illusion. It proved that peasants, properly organized and motivated, could kill knights. And that realization terrified the European aristocracy. Over the next century, knights across Europe began to adapt. Armor got heavier, tactics evolved to counter pike and halberd formations, but the shift had begun. The age of cavalry dominance was ending, the age of infantry was rising, and the Swiss were at the forefront of that transformation. Let's also talk about the terrain in more detail, because Morgarten wasn't just any mountain pass. It was a nightmare for an invading army. The pass ran along the eastern shore of Lake Egerie, a narrow glacial lake surrounded by steep, forested hills. The road through the pass was barely wide enough for a wagon. On the lakeside, the ground dropped off sharply into water. On the mountain side, the hillside rose steeply, covered in trees and loose rock. For an army moving through that pass, there was no way to deploy. No way to form battle lines, no way to use cavalry effectively. The column had to stay in single or double file, and that meant the entire army was vulnerable. If the front of the column was blocked, the whole army stopped. If the rear was attacked, the army was trapped. And if the column was hit from above, there was no cover, no escape, and no way to fight back effectively. The Swiss understood this. They knew that Leopold's army, no matter how large, could only fight with as many men as could fit in the width of the pass at any given time. The rest of the army was irrelevant. A 9,000-man force in a pass where only 20 men can fight abreast is effectively a 20-man force. The Swiss only had to defeat the men at the front of the column, and the rest would panic and break. That's exactly what happened. The initial avalanche of boulders and logs blocked the front of the Austrian column and threw it into chaos. The Swiss charge from the hillside hit the disorganized Austrians before they could recover, and once the front collapsed, the panic spread backward through the entire column. Men in the rear, who couldn't see what was happening, heard the screams, saw the front ranks retreating, and assumed the battle was lost. They turned and fled, and that turned the retreat into a rout. Leopold tried to rally his forces. He rode up and down the column, shouting orders, trying to restore order. But in the chaos of Morgarten, command and control were impossible. The noise was overwhelming. Units were separated by terrain. Officers couldn't find their men. And the Swiss kept pressing, pushing the Austrians back, cutting down anyone who stood to fight. Eventually, Leopold realized the battle was lost. He made the decision to retreat. He gathered what cavalry he could and fought his way out of the pass, heading south, back toward Habsburg territory. He abandoned his infantry, he abandoned his supplies, he abandoned the wounded, and he rode as fast as he could because staying meant death. The Swiss didn't pursue beyond the pass. They didn't need to. They had won. The Austrian army was shattered. Leopold was fleeing. And the message was sent: invade the Swiss valleys and you die. The aftermath of Morgarten sent shockwaves through the region. The news spread quickly. Peasants had defeated knights. Farmers had annihilated a professional army, and the Swiss valleys were still independent. The Habsburgs, despite their power and wealth, had been humiliated. For the Swiss, Morgarten was a vindication. It proved that their resistance wasn't hopeless. It proved that they could defend themselves, and it proved that unity worked. The three forest cantons, Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden, had fought together, coordinated their efforts, and won. That cooperation became the foundation of the Swiss Confederation. In December 1315, just weeks after Morgarten, representatives from the three cantons met and renewed the federal charter. They strengthened their alliance, formalized their mutual defense obligations, and invited other regions to join. Over the next few decades, Lucerne, Zurich, Bern, and other towns and regions signed on, creating a growing confederation of independent communities united by a shared commitment to self-governance and mutual defense. The Confederation wasn't a nation in the modern sense. It didn't have a central government. It didn't have a standing army. It didn't have a single ruler. Each canton governed itself according to its own traditions and laws. But when external threats emerged, the cantons coordinated, pooled resources, and fought together. That decentralized, flexible structure proved remarkably resilient. It survived wars, internal conflicts, and centuries of European political turmoil, and it still exists today. The Habsburgs didn't give up immediately. They tried to reassert control multiple times over the next century, but every attempt failed. At Sempach, in 1386, Swiss infantry defeated another Austrian army, killing Duke Leopold III of Austria in the process. At Neffels in 1388, a small Swiss force used the same tactics as Morgarten, terrain, ambush, and brutal close combat, to defeat a much larger Austrian force. Each victory reinforced Swiss independence and further eroded Habsburg authority in the region. By the mid-15th century, the Swiss Confederation was recognized as a de facto independent state. By the early 16th century, Swiss mercenaries were the most sought-after soldiers in Europe, famous for their discipline, ferocity, and effectiveness. And Switzerland itself had become the one place in Europe where commoners, not nobles, held political power. That's the long-term legacy of Morgarten. It didn't just win a battle. It created a political and military tradition that lasted for centuries and fundamentally shaped the development of Central Europe. Now let's talk about the broader implications of Morgarten for medieval warfare, because this battle was part of a larger shift happening across Europe in the 14th century. The dominance of heavy cavalry, the core of medieval military power for centuries, was being challenged by infantry armed with pikes, halberds, longbows, and crossbows. And battles like Morgarten, along with Courtrai 1302 and Bannockburn 1314, were proving that infantry, properly led and positioned, could defeat cavalry. This shift had profound consequences. Cavalry was expensive. Knights required years of training, expensive armor, and warhorses. Only the wealthy could afford to field cavalry in large numbers, which meant military power was concentrated in the hands of the nobility, but infantry was cheap. Peasants could be trained to use pikes or halberds in a matter of weeks. They didn't need expensive equipment, and they could be fielded in large numbers. That economic shift changed the balance of power. Kings and cities that could mobilize large infantry forces no longer depended on the nobility for military strength. They could raise armies from the common population. That reduced the political leverage of the aristocracy and contributed to the gradual centralization of state power over the late medieval and early modern periods. The Swiss were at the forefront of this infantry revolution. After Morgarten, they continued to refine their tactics. They developed the pike square, a dense formation of infantry armed with long pikes, bristling in every direction, nearly impossible for cavalry to break. They emphasized discipline, training, and coordination, and they proved, again and again, that infantry could dominate the battlefield. By the 16th century, Swiss mercenaries were employed by every major power in Europe. French kings, Spanish kings, the Pope, all of them hired Swiss soldiers. The phrase "no money, no Swiss" became famous, reflecting the mercenaries' professional approach to warfare. And the military reputation of Switzerland, built on victories like Morgarten, ensured that no one wanted to invade the Confederation itself. Why fight the Swiss when you could hire them? That mercenary tradition had downsides. Swiss soldiers fought on opposite sides of conflicts. Swiss pike squares faced each other on battlefields across Europe, and the Confederation itself sometimes fractured over questions of alliances and foreign policy. But the military prowess that started at Morgarten remained a defining feature of Swiss identity for centuries. Morgarten also had cultural and psychological impacts that are harder to quantify but equally important. The battle became a national myth. It was celebrated in songs, stories, and later in art and literature. It symbolized Swiss independence, courage, and the idea that ordinary people could stand up to tyranny and win. Every generation of Swiss grew up hearing the story of Morgarten, and that story reinforced the values that define the Confederation: independence, self-reliance, resistance to external authority. In modern Switzerland, Morgarten is still commemorated. There's a monument at the site of the battle. November 15 is remembered as a key date in Swiss history, and the battle is taught in schools as the founding moment of the Confederation. Whether or not every detail of the traditional narrative is historically accurate, and there are debates among historians about specifics, the cultural significance of Morgarten is undeniable. It's the origin story of Switzerland as a nation. Now let's return to Duke Leopold and the Habsburg perspective. Because Morgarten was a disaster for them, but it's worth understanding how they processed the defeat and what it meant for their long-term strategy. Leopold returned to Austria humiliated. He had led 9,000 men into the Swiss valleys and lost nearly 2,000 of them without achieving a single objective. He hadn't captured any cities, he hadn't forced any surrenders, he hadn't even made it through the mountains. He had been ambushed, routed, and forced to flee. For a Duke of the House of Habsburg, a family that prided itself on military and political dominance, that was unacceptable. The official Habsburg response was to downplay the defeat. They claimed the Swiss had used treachery, that the ambush violated the rules of honorable warfare, that the battle didn't count because it wasn't fought in the open field. These were excuses, of course, but they were necessary excuses. Admitting that peasants had legitimately defeated the Habsburg army would have been politically disastrous, but privately, the Habsburgs understood the implications. The Swiss couldn't be intimidated, they couldn't be easily conquered, and trying to force the issue would cost more men, more money, and more prestige than it was worth. So the Habsburgs shifted strategy. Instead of direct military conquest, they tried political pressure, economic isolation, and selective military campaigns against individual Swiss cantons. None of it worked. The Swiss remained united enough to resist, and the Habsburgs eventually gave up. That failure haunted the Habsburgs. The Swiss Confederation became a thorn in their side for centuries. Swiss mercenaries fought against Habsburg armies in Italy, France, and Germany. Swiss independence undermined Habsburg authority in the region. And the very existence of the Confederation, a political entity based on peasant self-governance and mutual defense, was a constant reminder that the Habsburg model of centralized noble authority wasn't the only option. In the long run, the Habsburgs adapted. They focused their expansion efforts elsewhere, into Hungary, Bohemia, Spain, the Netherlands. They became one of the most powerful dynasties in European history, but they never conquered Switzerland. And that failure started at Morgarten. So what's the final takeaway from all of this? What does Morgarten teach us that applies beyond medieval Swiss history? First, never underestimate the power of desperation. The Swiss weren't professional soldiers, they weren't experienced warriors, but they were fighting for survival, and that desperation translated into a level of ferocity and commitment that the Austrians couldn't match. Professional soldiers fight for pay, for honor, for obligation. Desperate people fight to the death. There's a difference. Second, terrain and tactics can overcome numerical and technological superiority. The Austrians had more men, better equipment, and professional training. None of it mattered in a narrow mountain pass where they couldn't deploy their cavalry and had no room to maneuver. The Swiss understood their environment and used it as a weapon. That's not luck, that's strategy. Third, unity is a force multiplier. The three forest cantons could have fought separately and been destroyed piecemeal. Instead, they coordinated, pooled their resources, and presented a unified front. That unity made them stronger than the sum of their parts, and it's the reason the Swiss Confederation survived and grew. Fourth, paradigm shifts happen when the impossible becomes reality. Before Morgarten, the idea that peasants could defeat knights was laughable. After Morgarten, it was proven. And once that psychological barrier was broken, the entire military landscape of Europe began to change. The age of cavalry dominance was ending. The age of infantry was beginning. and Morgarten was one of the key moments in that transition. Finally, Morgarten teaches us that power is always more fragile than it appears. The Habsburgs looked invincible. They had wealth, armies, political legitimacy, and centuries of tradition, but they lost to farmers in a mountain pass. Because power that depends on intimidation and overwhelming force collapses when someone refuses to be intimidated and finds a way to neutralize that force. The Swiss refused to be intimidated. They found a way, and they won. Morgarten isn't just a battle. It's a case study in asymmetric warfare, in the power of desperation, in the importance of terrain, and in the resilience of people who refuse to surrender. It's a reminder that history isn't determined by the powerful alone. Sometimes, the powerless change everything. November 15, 1315. Morgarten, 1,500 Swiss farmers. 9,000 Austrian knights. A narrow pass, an avalanche of rocks, a charge down the hillside, and the birth of Switzerland. If you made it this far, if this story meant something to you, here's what I need. Hit that like button, leave a comment, tell me what you think. What other battles deserve this kind of deep analysis? What do you think would have happened if Leopold had won at Morgarten? Would the Swiss Confederation have formed anyway, or would the Habsburgs have crushed the resistance permanently? And subscribe, because this is what we do here, real history. The kind that doesn't get taught in schools, the kind that challenges assumptions and digs into the details. No fluff, no oversimplification, just the raw, strategic, tactical truth about how ordinary people changed the world. Morgarten, the day farmers killed knights, the day Switzerland was born. The day the rules of medieval warfare started to change. That's history, real history.